Our scripture reading this morning comes from the book of Job, chapter 23, verses 1 through 9, and then 16 through 17. Then Job answered, "Today also my complaint is bitter. His hand is heavy despite my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his dwelling. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, but he would give heed to me. There an upright person could reason with him, and I should be acquitted forever by my judge. If I go forward, he is not there, or backward, I cannot perceive him. On the left, he hides, and I cannot behold him. I turn to the right, but I cannot see him. God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me. If only I could vanish in darkness, and thick darkness would cover my face." A word of God for a people of God. Thanks be to God.
This week I ran into one of my preacher buddies, pastor of a church over in Kirkwood, and I just half mentioned to him, we're preaching through the book of Job in October, and he started laughing. He said, "Last year I did 5 Sundays in Job, and by the end they were begging me to stop." You have in your worship guide this insert again. It's volume 2, it's act 2 of Playbill. It's a recognition that Job in and of itself is a drama. And so to think of it in dramatic terms and to see the motion that is within it and the way the story is told is a wonderful thing to do. Old Testament scholar Carla Sumala compares this middle stretch this week and next week of Job to flyover territory. Now, we know something about flyover country, don't we? Go outside, well, maybe on a day that's not so cloudy, and what you will see high up in the heavens are flights that are passing over us. They're going from New York to LA, and they're going from Miami to Chicago, and west to east. And we are in the middle, we are at the crossroads of the country. This is flyover territory. There's a lot about this part of the country that people fly over, but they don't always stop, do they? So we see a lot of traffic that goes by. That's us here in the Midwest. And between the bookends of Job, there's a beginning, and it tips over the first domino, and the story starts following along until the conclusion in chapter 42. There's these long middle passages. And to be honest, they're very hard to read. They're just difficult. And I found out a reason why this past week. That in the writing of Job, what you have on the first and the last are prose sections. These are stories that are about the story itself, and they begin to tell the story, and they tell it in a narrative kind of way. But then when you get to the middle section, the squishy middle of Job, it becomes poetry. I can't help but think of high school English, of reading long narrative poetry and having such a difficult time understanding where the story was, and it was in poetic verse, and it's framed in poetic thought. This way, we love the prose. We want story. We want plot. We want action. Like most unwanted advice from friends who think they know better, the speeches of Job's friends are written as poetry, and frankly, they are repetitious and tedious. Poet Elizabeth Alexander, in a conversation with Krista Tippett on NPR called Own Being, suggests that reading and writing poetry are often the ways in which we describe very deep truth. The poets can go there and pull us along with them in their phrasing and in their choice of words, and a particular word can be extremely important, and they are able to describe deep truth in this way. Other forms of literature will have to work and struggle to cause that to happen. Maybe this is the reason poetry is the primary vehicle of communication in the book of Job. The bulk of Job is written in poetry, poetic form, which is essentially about tackling ultimate issues. At the heart of this story is a thing that is so important to us in our existence. I ran across it in another novel this week, where the novelist takes a quote from Job, the book of Job, and quotes it in the novel. It's just something that artists of all different kinds have used to study and to think about the perspectives of pain. Yet when we're forced to read through this poetic middle with all of its interminable speeches, we realize what hard work it is. It's just difficult for us to get into the speeches of the friends. We're drawn to stories and we're familiar with the movement, a structure which is, Aristotle had the structure of a beginning, a middle, and an end. He's the one who created this framework by which stories are told. Dramatic stories are told with this in mind, that it has a beginning, has a place of beginning, has a middle section, and then it has an end. And when we hold memory in our minds and we hold events in our minds, we create story forms. The stories that we have a beginning to them. There's a middle section, or dramatic middle, and there's a conclusion. The day that 3 of my high school buddies and I skipped school and went fishing in May of our senior year, we skipped school. It had a beginning. We all left home like we were going to school. We picked up our rods and reels, and then we convened somewhere. I shouldn't be telling you guys, the confirmands here. We'll talk about sin later. I was gone all day fishing, had a great time. And then at the end, the ending was the next morning when I showed up at school and my face was so sunburned and I had a note of being sick from my mother. A beginning, a middle, and an end. I'm sorry, I confess to you. That's the way we hold memory, though. All of our memories tend to have this story format to them, and that's what this has. This is exactly what happens, though, when we try to give unwanted advice. We begin to become poetic. We begin to have a point to our poetry. We miss the story that's actually at work in someone's life. We would do better, like Job's friends, to just sit for a few days in the dirt, not saying anything. We would do better by doing that, by living with him in his pain and sharing his despair. There's an old saying that says, don't just sit there, do something. Sometimes we do. But what we ought to do is occasionally flip that on its head and say, don't just do something, sit there. Sit with someone who is in pain. Don't even attempt words. Presence is comforting. So 2 things have happened to Job in this week from last week. First, he has these friends, Job's friends. He has these friends. Doesn't everybody have friends like this? Ever encountered them in your life? Of course you have. At first, Job's friends are reduced to silence by the enormity of his loss. He has lost everything. We cannot imagine how much suffering and pain he has gone through, so much loss. And so they step back and they wait in silence, and they accompany him in that manner, which is so often the best of all, a quiet sharing of grief, a stunned stillness of wonder that so much can go wrong, to be in awe of the situation as it is, to share in that with the one who is suffering. But then these friends get antsy, they get restless, too much sitting. And they, like most of us, most of the time, believe that life should be just. It should be fair. It's like a big accounting issue. There's a balance to this and to that he does. In our presumptive ideal world, bad things do not happen to good people. We are raised with that kind of mentality until it's finally driven out of our lives by our own suffering. They begin to accuse Job. You must have done something wrong. They begin to think. The machinations of the mind, it begins to just turn over. What is it that Job has done? You must have made some terrible mistakes. You must have engaged in evils that none of us know about, some secret life that you have lived. And the only explanation for the calamities that have befallen him, they're his fault. That's the rational thinking about a moral world. You do evil, and bad things are going to find you. The righteous are not cut off, they tell him. That's a powerful thing to say to someone who is suffering. The wicked are punished. Job must have deserved what happened to him. And we know all about how this kind of line of reasoning goes. Every one of us. Have you heard about the teenager's bad behavior? And then the friends around that family will say something like those parents. They must have done something wrong. Wow. They must have done something wrong. There's something not right in that house. Have you ever thought that wouldn't have happened to her if she dressed decently? That's a line I've heard before. It wouldn't have happened to him if he had stayed in the right neighborhood, if he had not gone into that bad neighborhood. Have you ever wondered when something terrible has happened in your own life that God is punishing you for something? We want life to be fair, don't we? We want God to be just. And we want to understand when life is being lived in some other way. We want to be able to balance the books at the end of the day. And that's the second thing that happens in this story, this flyover portion of Job. This time at which the friends are muttering their little speeches and giving their poetic advice. And Job begins to separate from them because of his own anguish and his frustration. And he turns his conversation from his friends to God. He makes that move. He stops talking with his friends. He describes them in this book as miserable comforters with windy words. That's pretty cute. It does capture something, doesn't it? Miserable comforters with windy words. But God, he wants to hear from God. He is through with his friends. They have unloaded their advice. Now what he wants is to have this conversation with God, this direct line of speech. I will give free utterance to my complaint, he says. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend against me. Does it seem good to you to oppress? Are you having fun, God? Do you see me as humans see? You know that I am not guilty, and yet you turn and destroy me. That's pretty blunt. If you were a teenager and you tried that with your mother or your father, you would be in trouble. This is not the kind of language that we carry on with people like that. Where is God? And that's what Job is asking. Where are you? You heard in the text about he's not in front of me, and he's not behind me, he's not to my left, and he's not to my right. This is a full 360 view. Nowhere do I have a sense that God is present with me. And so he begins to cry out. And in the crying out, he resorts to a new form of literature called a lament. This comes out of the portions of the Bible in which the deepest heartfelt needs are thrown up to God in a cry of pain and impatience. And what he's trying to do, he's trying to stimulate conversation with God who is silent. There's this long tradition in the Bible called lament. Sometimes we think, or perhaps we've been told, that it's somehow wrong, or that it's incorrect, that it's rude to talk to God in such blunt honesty, to express our deepest anger, to share our fears with God, and our sadness to God with God. I don't know where we get that idea because the Bible doesn't teach it. We think we're only allowed to express gratitude, the happy experience with God. All the things that I'm grateful for, the thankfulness. I love that attitude. But on some occasions, that's not appropriate. We think we're allowed to only ask God nicely and that God will nicely respond to us, but that's not how it works. Somehow in the lament, we learn to utter our cry. It becomes too much to hold back. We can't bottle it up. We can't just hang on to it. We can't suppress it for long. Job cannot find or see or hear God, but he remains undeterred. What is the great grace, the great gift of God reflected in Job's words? That he longs for God. He longs for God's presence. That his hope in God and his belief in God's care for him will persist. That he is certain that the silence of God is not the last thing that he will hear. The silence of God is very silent. When God clams up, there is total silence. We are not accustomed to that. It's difficult for us to interpret. When anyone that we know loves us goes silent, we struggle with that. What does it mean? When your partner in life stops talking to you, it's not a good sign. When a child clams up and won't talk to you about what they're feeling, that's not a good sign. Jesus is the Word. There is language that is spoken. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God uttered a word. God spoke the world into existence. It's great mystery. I don't fully understand what that means other than the divine has a sense of power in the words that are shared. And Jesus is the Word. Jesus is God spoken, speaking into humanity, becoming one of us. And we know that when we, like Job, experience that vast silence in which God resides in times of trial, that we too long to know that God is there. Just the comforting presence of recognizing God is close to me can be enough, can overcome the void of words that are not there. Too much talk and not enough presence, we would maybe think. And if we have the integrity of Job, we say so. We just speak with God as we are experiencing. If we have a remnant of hope, even in the face of destruction of all that we love, we say that as well. Wendell Berry is a wonderful essayist and novelist and a poet, and he's an amazing, amazing man. He's thoughtful. He is the great writer of the natural world. If you've not discovered Wendell Berry, I suggest that you find something of his. He says that the distinguishing characteristic of absolute silence is silence. Just the fact that it's there, to observe it, to recognize it as such. Many of the voices that we hear in the Psalms, the songbook, the prayer book of the Bible, of the Jewish people, and most particularly in the book of Psalms, are the cries of lament. There's even a book in the Hebrew Scriptures called Lamentations. It is this capturing of the lament of the people and bringing it together in some reflection, some ability to reflect on what has happened to them. Other laments are in the voices of the prophets and in the words of Jesus himself. As he died upon the cross, he reached into that old prayer book and he lifted a line. My God, why have you forsaken me? Psalm 22. We know Psalm 23, but back it up just a scoosh, and you come to Psalm 22:1. My God, why have you forsaken me? These are the first words, and these are the words that echo the lament of human beings for centuries, both before him and after him. Where are you, God? Why have you abandoned me? We say these words on occasion when we're pushed to the edge. Maybe recently you can imagine the people who have experienced the hurricanes that both came up through the Gulf and came down through the eastern seaboard. And the total destruction of many of those communities. They're digging for survivors even this morning, I read. That was, 4 days ago? They're still looking for survivors. They're looking for people who have been killed in the midst of the rubble, people who have lost everything. Maybe you think about the fires of California or Oregon and Washington Arizona, where hell itself has blown down those canyons, and the valleys and the smoke and the flames have engulfed the homes of people who wondered, why have you forsaken us? When a young girl in Pakistan is shot in the head for speaking out for the education of girls, or when a child we know dies of cancer or is catastrophically injured, do we not wonder, in the words of the psalmist, Psalm 88, "O God, why do you cast us off?" The feeling of being separated from God, heightened by the silence that comes our way. At the end of the lament, when the words and the music have stilled themselves and the one suffering from the silence and despair of God's empty absence, there emerges a thread of hope. Even in the book of Job, as sorry as it is, he finds that slender thread of hope. Down in the depths of despair, where he turned his voice to God, in that emptiness, he clung to a thread of hope and he proclaimed this, "I know my Redeemer lives, and that at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has thus been destroyed, then in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see on my side, and my eyes shall behold and not another." That's quite the line for the book of Job. I know my Redeemer lives. We sing this during Holy Week. It is a wonderful note of hope and possibility, even in the midst of darkness, even in the midst of the silence of God, even in the midst of all the bad advice I've been given by my friends. Even in the midst of all of that, a slender thread of hope is ours to cling to. Amen.